Hi everyone, my name is Kate Hooper. I'm a policy analyst with the Migration Policy Institute, and I will be moderating this call. With me, we have Mariam Zar, who is the founder of Women Found and commissioner at the LA Commission on the Status of Women, and Todd Snyder, who is the founder and CEO of Lost Faces of Humanity Foundation. So thanks again for taking time out of your busy schedule to speak with us on this topic. So COVID-19 has upended our lives in many ways, and today we're going to explore the impact it's having on a particularly vulnerable population, refugees. In the past month, we've seen the introduction of border closures and travel restrictions around the world. By my latest count, there are now restrictions in place in more than 170 countries. This carries significant implications for migrant and refugee communities. Restrictions on travel apply if you're not a citizen or a permanent resident of the country you're trying to reach, which creates major issues for people whose jobs rely on their ability to travel and to work across borders. We're already seeing the impact of this pause on mobility in sectors like agriculture, which rely on large numbers of seasonal workers from other countries for harvesting and planting, which is creating real concern about the impact on food supply. And we've also just seen the disruption brought about by these restrictions, which were introduced quite abruptly in some cases. So there are cases where people are unable to undertake essential travel and families are separated. The closure of immigration offices has also left people in limbo. It is now difficult to extend or renew permits, which risks scenarios where migrants lapse into unauthorized status or lose their authorization to work. And in the US, USCIS has suspended in-person services. This means that it's really difficult to move forward with applications for permanent residence, naturalization, or asylum, and immigration court hearings have also been suspended. We're seeing a similar situation in many European countries, which have also taken the decision to suspend some of these services as well. And of course, at the same time, it's increasingly difficult to return home. We're seeing some visitors who are stranded by border closures and travel restrictions and who may just be unable to find flights to take them back to their country of origin. Before we get started, I wanted to talk briefly about some of the specific challenges for refugee populations that this crisis has created. The widespread travel restrictions has led to the temporary suspension of refugee resettlement worldwide. This means that refugees who were due to be resettled in other countries are now stuck in limbo. It's becoming harder as well to lodge claims for asylum, whether this is because immigration offices are closed or because people are now physically unable to reach the country of destination in the first place, which is generally a requirement for lodging an asylum claim. And in some cases, we're seeing situations, including in the United States, where people are being returned to the country they just came from, or even the country that they fled in the first place, citing public health concerns. This raises pretty serious concerns that the principle of non-refoulement, which is where you don't return people to a country where they are likely to face persecution, is being undermined. And then finally, another concern which I think we'll reflect on today are the conditions that many refugees and asylum seekers live in. We see situations where refugees and asylum seekers may be living in quite cramped living quarters and they have limited access to services, including healthcare. And so this raises concerns that they may be especially vulnerable to the spread of COVID-19. In the Greek islands, for example, some of the camps that are designed to hold populations like refugees and asylum seekers are holding up to 5 times their normal capacity. So this really raises concerns about whether you can prevent the spread of this virus. And our first speaker, Mariam, will reflect on some of these challenges. Just a quick reminder before we get started with the discussion. As Thomas mentioned, please feel free to submit questions via the Q&A tool in the bottom right-hand corner of your video box. We'll save all of these questions for the last 15 minutes or so, but obviously as questions occur, please feel free to submit them. So now I'm going to turn over to Mariam Zar to talk about the situation in Greece.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here to talk about these things, the entire refugee crisis, but especially the circumstances at this moment right now. Kate, thank you for that introduction and for framing the conversation so well. I was in Moria in February, so we're just in April. So I was in Moria not very long ago. Moria is, I like to say it's one of the most notorious refugee camps on earth. It's in the Aegean. It's on the island of Lesbos, which is just a few miles away from Turkey. And so people come by dinghy. So those classic pictures that you see of people, you know, sort of rushing off dinghies, wet and bewildered and somehow needing help to get onto dry land. That's where I was. Much to my surprise, when I got to the island, I realized that it's very, very close to Turkey. So it's temptingly close to Turkey, so much so that as I was driving up the coastline, my cell provider would switch over to Turkish Telecom. So the idea that there are people, that there are desperate people on the other side looking at the European continent and thinking maybe I can make a run for it really seemed to make sense to me at that moment. Kate mentioned this, you know, the limbo that these people are in. They're in limbo anyway, under the best of circumstances in, you know, 2015, when the world had, I think, at least a little bit more empathy, and millions of people were coming from Turkey and the Middle East over to Europe, thinking that Greece would be the gateway to the rest of Europe. They were in limbo anyway. As Kate says, a lot of them end up on these Aegean islands where there are refugee camps that were built not as refugee camps. In a lot of cases, there are detention centers that were built by Greece for their own uses. And they were built for maybe 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000 people, and then they were repurposed into refugee camps. And as people came, early on, as people would come and they would be processed and they would move on, the flow would increase because that gateway seemed to really be a possibility. Over the course of the last couple of years, that gateway has dwindled. And so there's a much faster stream of people that come in than there are that go out. So now a camp that was built maybe to be a detention center for 3,000 people is hosting something like 20,000 people. And that is not a myth. I saw it with my own eyes. The camp that's been built is busting beyond its own boundaries. So if it was built for 3,000 people, and let's say it could have accommodated 7,000 people, it's doing that and more. So now there are people who live in the groves around that detention center. Those groves belong to Greek people, and Greek people are not very happy about the fact that their olive trees or their orange trees or their animals are being threatened in some way. Those are livelihoods also. What's happening now with the COVID-19 crisis is that nothing is happening. So there are no asylum cases that are being processed. And I have to say that, you know, refugees who come to Europe really only speak their own language. They don't speak the language of the European nation they're landing in. And for the most part, they also don't speak English. So information is not something that they have readily. They are guessing. So a couple of weeks ago, a large barge came from Athens to the island of Lesbos, where where Moria is, and nobody knew what that barge was there for. So there was a rumor around camp that that barge was there to take everybody to Athens to save them. In fact, it wasn't. It was only there to take the new arrivals that were coming in from Turkey that were presumed to maybe be infected with coronavirus. The barge was there to keep them, not under great conditions. So here I was every morning searching for news and replying to a flurry of texts from women in the camp saying, Mariam, what is this barge? Should we be making a run for it? And I'd be trying to say, no, you shouldn't be making a run for anything. No one's going anywhere. So again, they have many, many issues. Hygiene is definitely one of them. Quality of life, food. You know, we're in touch with an NGO right now that's making masks. I emailed them yesterday and I said, can I send you any clothes? He said, you know, they don't need clothes, they need food. They need information. So yes, they are very much in limbo, and any kind of crisis only makes it worse, much less if it's a global pandemic like coronavirus. It's just, it's a huge weight around their neck added to what is already the kind of burden that very few of us know how to face.
Thanks, Mariam. I think that your points about how this sort of exacerbates a crisis that was already going on in terms of this bottleneck of people who've arrived who have these asylum cases that are going through this system very, very slowly, and the challenges of accessing information, all really pertinent. I mean, I think that thinking about this crisis, it's about how it's exacerbating existing situations in ways that are quite problematic.
I know you're going to switch to Todd. I just
Yes.
quickly want to make a point that actually relates to what you were saying. So for a very long time, UNHCR used to operate a small sort of a secondary camp nearby. So when people came by dinghy and they were taken and dried and given blankets, they would spend 24 to 36 hours at this secondary camp before they were transferred to Moria. UNHCR is no longer doing that. That camp was closed. So what ends up happening now is that the people who come by dinghy from Turkey are literally left on the shore because nobody wants to integrate them into a camp that's on lockdown. And so literally they are so much in limbo that they sit on the shores. They make fires at night because there's no secondary camp, there's no service, there's no processing. They're literally in the wilderness indefinitely.
Wow.
That's pretty sad.
Okay, over to you, Todd, to
Yes.
talk about the situation in Ethiopia.
Yeah, hi Kate. Thanks, Miriam. And yeah, Ethiopia. I've spent quite a bit of time on the ground in Gambela, Ethiopia, which is I think one of the closest cities to South Sudan in Ethiopia. And I think statistics show there's about 400,000 refugees in the region. I was been fortunate enough to kind of visit the refugee camps in the area with my teenage daughter, and I was really shocked. A lot of the camps that we visited, the children range from infants to teenagers, and about 60% of the camps are youth that had to were either born in the camps or had to flee South Sudan during the Civil War. So there's quite a bit of youth in these camps, and it was sort of a shock to kind of see kids my daughter's age having to live in these kind of bleak kind of areas with very little resources. They have the support of UNHCR and the Ethiopian government, which has really opened their borders and is terrific to asylum seekers throughout the East African region. And just to learn that there's about 400,000 refugees living in the area. I mean, it's just a wall of people. And yesterday I was communicating with the Ethiopian embassy, and they've confirmed that this coronavirus has really locked things down for NGOs and assistance for doctors and even relief effort to get into the camps, just because of this global lockdown. So a lot of these refugees are what little they had before is going to be even little to today. So it's it's a big problem that we're facing, and there's a lot of concerns about the coronavirus spreading through these camps and limited medical treatment in these camps. The Gambela is really a small town, on the edge of Ethiopia bordering Sudan. So it's got a lot of, issues with getting in and out of there. So definitely a crisis that's going to need a lot of attention. So, I in fact, when this lifts, I look forward to going back and, with my NGO, kind of helping with what we can with, the basic necessities, from school supplies to blankets to food, whatever we can bring in.
Thanks, Todd. I think that the point you raise about us thinking about lockdown as both affecting the refugee populations themselves, but also having implications for the services that flow in, whether that's, assistance or whether that's even medical assistance, is really important. Could both of you speak a little bit about what the conditions are like on the ground in terms of access to healthcare?
Yeah.
And what, if in a scenario where we see breakouts in these camps, what kind of access to doctors do these populations have?
Yeah, I was actually going to make a comment about that when Todd was speaking, just to say that to try to have people be able to visualize what it looks like in these camps, even under the best of circumstances. So, bathroom amenities or hygiene amenities are not readily available or clean in the first place. So for example, at Moria, in order to go to the Moria bathroom and use those facilities, the average person has to wait in line upwards of 2 hours. And when you actually go there, it is dirty. And this is not a criticism of the Greek government. They're doing the best that they can do. I know the Greek consul general in LA. I talk to her all the time. This is not at all a criticism. It's overwhelming humanity. But, you know, the floor is dirty. The space is fetid. The stalls are dirty. You know, hygiene at its best in a refugee camp is subpar. Hygiene, when you're worried about a virus taking hold, is a conversation that's a non-starter. As far as healthcare, and again, while I was there the first 2 weeks of February. So even though there was coronavirus already around the world, it hadn't quite gotten to Europe yet. So I went through the airport with my mask on, but I wasn't worried. So the word and the concept had been introduced, but the worry wasn't there yet. There was something called the Moria flu going around, which was frightful enough to begin with. So anybody who had the slightest cough or even a fever for a day or two would really be worried about becoming really sick, severely sick. There are clinics at the camp. So again, we're talking about upwards of 20,000 people. There's a formal clinic that's run by the Greek government and UNHCR. In order to go to the clinic, people would have to stand in line, I kid you not, at 3 or 4 a.m. in order to be seen by 3 or 4 p.m. By then, there would have been so many urgencies that would come through that the average person with a cough or a cold or a fever would really not have a chance to be seen. So while I was there, I went to a pharmacy. I thought, you know what, I'm just going to get some of the basic over-the-counter things that I know I use in my life and it can help. So let me see if I can get some for the girls that were in our program, the women that I had met, and their friends and families. While I was at the pharmacy, I met a Dutch nurse. She was a Dutch ER nurse who was running a local Dutch-run clinic. And she had the same experience. She said, you know, by the time the day gets going, there are so many urgencies where life and death is on the line that we really can't get to the people who really maybe just need a Tylenol to take care of a fever or cough medicine to take care of a cough and they can get better. So the point I'm trying to make is that the normalest illness gets exacerbated. When you're talking about coronavirus or a deadly virus that's very contagious, there is really no plan, no realistic plan that can be made in a refugee camp to stop it from passing like wildfire. Again, I'm in touch with an NGO on the ground. They have been mixing Clorox and water, and in the middle of the night, when use is slow, they're going into the bathrooms at Moria and they're spraying them. I can send a picture so everybody can take a look after the webcast. They're spraying down the bathrooms, which is great. It's great. It's disinfecting the bathrooms. But literally by the next day, there are thousands of people who've lined up to use these bathrooms. And, you know, it's the process of trying to internalize the idea that none of the prevention mechanisms or strategies that we contemplate here in the West are going to be applicable or effective when you're talking about camps that are severely overcrowded and hygiene is simply not available. It's just not available.
Yeah, it's so true. And even, you know, like I said, in the perfect conditions, things are difficult. I know, you know, the camps I've visited, I've been to the camps where people aren't even classified as a refugee that just kind of walked in from Sudan. And, you know, those conditions, I mean, you know, they do have World Health is on the ground helping. I mean, the Ethiopian government, they're terrific. They do, you know, above and beyond what other regions on the planet do. And, you know, but, you know, give an example, the water, just simple things like water to wash your hands. You know, girls, children, kids, grandmothers are carrying water, 5-gallon buckets, you know, 5-10 kilometers just to get water to the camp to cook, let alone to wash your hands. So these are serious issues. And, you know, I think, you know, if that doesn't get addressed and, you know, the virus does spread into some of these camps, you're going to see, you know, some serious issues here. And, you know, I mean, just simple things like, you know, that we take for granted. So it's definitely an issue. Like you said, with the medicine, it's, you know, there might be one doctor to, you know, handle, you know, 10,000 people. So, and now with the limiting of doctors even entering, I mean, I know there's a, you know, a ban on, you know, even bringing, you know, foreign people into the country because of the fear of spreading the disease. So, you know, we've got a major issue right now.
Anecdotally, I can share with you all that even while I was there, and again, not with the threat of coronavirus hanging over people's heads, one story that stands out to me is a 21-year-old girl who is in that camp with her minor brother. They're Afghan, and so when she wanted to come and come get to Europe, her family thought it was absolutely frightful that she should make this journey alone as a girl. So they asked her 14-year-old brother to join her. He was supposed to be protection. He is now her greatest worry because she's 21 and can manage herself, but she cannot manage her younger 14-year-old brother. So she had a story where she had waited for days and days and days to hear from a rumor mill around the camp that there was going to be warm water. So one morning she decided she was going to take a shower because there was supposed to be warm water on that day. She stood in line for 3 hours. When she finally got under the water, the warm water had run out. So she was taking a cold shower. We're talking about a cold shower on a cold day. And she says as soon as she soaped her hair and was ready to rinse, the water turned off. So in the cold, shivering, she waited for a few minutes for the water to come back. It didn't come back. There's no rhyme or reason. They're just guessing. The water didn't come back. She eventually had to towel off the soap that was on her and, give up the idea of showering and go home. So that's under normal circumstances.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. And, and it's, an issue that, most of the world doesn't cover. The part that I find sort of appalling is currently we've got about 70.5 million refugees on our planet. Give or take, Ethiopia sometimes has up to, 1 million, depending on, the current statistics. Because one thing Ethiopia does, it allows refugees to work within the country, where a lot of countries don't allow that. But, pre-coronavirus, with the amount of refugees on our planet, and our media doesn't cover it. They shed zero light on this crisis of people that are displaced. I mean, I look at what's taking place down in Syria. You've got refugees all over the planet, and they're getting zero media attention. And I find that just to be appalling, that our media and our mainstream communication just doesn't shed just a tiny little bit of light on this. And, perhaps if, more people were aware of this global crisis, I think we'd get a lot more help. I know when I speak to doctors here in Los Angeles, I've got half a dozen doctors that would love to join me on a trip to Ethiopia to help the refugees. There's business owners that we're talking to. There's, all kinds of people now that are aware of this that want to come in and help. And, hopefully this coronavirus will get, resolved where we can start traveling again. And, I think this is a wake-up call for, people that are displaced. It's time to, kick in a little bit. Let's help these people because, you close your eyes, we're all one humanity. And, I think it's time that, we lower those numbers and allow these, people that have been displaced due to war and conflicts to, have a safe place to live.
Thanks, Todd. I just wanted to give you the opportunity because I know that you'd got some photos of the camps. Did you want to share those with the participants to kind of give them a flavor of where you've been?
Yeah, and I think Thomas might have those. I'm still trying to figure out this Zoom technology.
There we go.
There we go.
We've got them up.
Yeah, that first image was Gambella that we kind of went through there. Yeah, that's some of the kids in the camp.
Amazing pictures, Todd.
Yeah, thanks. There's my daughter
There's
at the World Food Program on the ground. There's some of the refugee kids seeing images from themselves for the first time. And, they were just amazing. Some of the kindest kids on planet Earth with just the shirts on their back.
I did notice that a camera in a refugee camp elicits quite a reaction.
It's unbelievable. Yeah. And we were handing out, my daughter was handing out clothing and, these kids were just loving, t-shirts, Gap t-shirts or, dresses or, you know, socks, shoes, anything. They were just, you know, so grateful.
I was going to share that, well, your pictures are truly amazing, Todd.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's a refugee I met in, he was in Greece this summer, and he, you know, he was just so excited. He had his family out of a conflict zone, and his, you know, he shared with me that his dream was to make it to Europe and eventually to the United States. But he was grateful that he had his family with him. You know, he was selling bracelets to tourists, and he said, you know, it's just, I'm very fortunate. My family's with me, and I feel, you know, it's great to be alive. That's Gambela, Ethiopia, which is, you know, there's about approximately 400,000 refugees living in that region, and you know, some of the kindest people to meet on planet Earth. I've never in my life met, you know, nicer people that, you know, just I think, you know, I feel they have a second chance and they want to live, and they're really grateful to be alive. And thank God for the Ethiopian, you know, government allowing them to come in and have safety. Yeah, that's a video. I'm not sure. It's kind of some footage of, you know, one of the camps.
Lovely.
That was great. Thank you so much, Todd. It's nice to really sort of put an individual perspective on these crises and sort of see some of the people who you're talking about on a very individual basis. So thank you. So I'm going to open up the Q&A to participants. So as a quick reminder, to submit a question, go to the bottom of your screen, click on the Q&A button, and you'll be able to leave a question in there. And I can then relay that onto the speakers. To begin, I thought it might be helpful for a moment, just following on Todd's presentation, to take a step back and talk about the different populations who are living in these camps and why they're there in the first place. So maybe just a little bit of information for some of the participants who may be less familiar with these refugee crises. You know, which countries are people coming from, and what sort of conditions are they trying to escape? And maybe we could start with Mariam on that question.
Sure. I wonder if you can all see me because I went away from my screen.
We can, don't worry.
Good. So yeah, I was actually going to pick up on that when Todd was talking about, you know, mainstream media and just awareness out there. One of the things that I found most interesting about the time that I spent in Moria was that a great majority of the refugees in Moria were Afghan. They were either Afghan from Afghanistan, or they were Afghans who had gone to Iran first and come then by land from Iran to Turkey and over to Europe. I happen to be Persian. I'm Iranian. You know, some 40 years ago, I made a similar exodus. I left Iran, we landed in Paris, and then we came to the States under much easier circumstances. I was happy, I was thrilled to be able to go back and see this refugee camp, but I didn't expect to run into so many people who actually spoke Farsi. I didn't expect to really be able to understand people in their own native tongue. And so I was able to relay their stories using social media in real time back to my friends and followers in the States. And the reaction that I got was really very surprising. Very, very many of my peers, so other Iranian Americans or Iranian whatevers who live outside of Iran, were incredibly interested in what I was doing. You know, were tied to my little posts every day and wanted to know how they could join me or what they could do or how they could help or how they could give back or become part of the solution. So I totally agree with Todd. I think that if these stories were told in a more personal way, I think that people would really connect to the plight of 80 million people around this globe trying to find a better way to live or more stable circumstances. But I also think it's important for everyone around the globe to begin to comprehend why there are 80 million people running around the world looking for a more stable way to live. And that's because we as a civilization preside over lots of conflict around the world. We don't see it in the States. We don't see it in a lot of wonderful places where people live, but there is an inordinate amount of conflict that rages for years, for generations, in places around the world that we as a people should really begin to take responsibility for. You know, Syria is a gut-wrenching story, but Afghanistan is an example of conflict that has been raging on their soil for 40 years. So if you think about your own family and its trajectory over the course of 40 years, that's about 3 generations worth of war, right? So, you know, 40 years ago, just think about if you're 50 years old right now, you would have been a 10-year-old child. And for that entire period of time, there's been war. And in a lot of these, at least in the Middle East, and a lot of these conservative societies, when conflict sets in, the rights of women and girls tend to be the first to go. And so a lot of the people I met had really made this horrible, terrible, perilous exodus in order to be able to attain an education. And to them, it seemed as though if they could have a chance to be educated, they could create a better future for themselves. And frankly, at every turn, they had not been able to. You know, for Afghans in Iran, they hadn't been welcome to stay. They hadn't been able to enroll their children in school. Women had not been treated fairly. Frankly, neither had the men. And even here at the refugee camp, there is no education. You know, the kids I met that were the same age as my own children were definitely not learning. They weren't adding to their knowledge base. And I kept thinking, so many of them want to grow up to be journalists or doctors or whatever. They had their dreams, but you know, in order to get to those dreams, they'd have to find a stable place to live and you know, gain the knowledge that they'd have to gain to be able to matriculate in a real world. And it's just not happening. Like Todd says, it's 80 million people that are just not accounted for, and the world keeps looking away.
So true. And, you know, I think what it's going to take now is just shedding light on this subject. And, you know, I know when I go back to Ethiopia, one of the things we're going to do is, you know, I was able to photograph about 5,000 of the refugees living in the camps. And what I want to do now is go back and personalize it, where I want to share their story. You know, most of the kids and families that I met in Ethiopia within the refugee camps were displaced during the South Sudan war between 2013 and 2020, where 4 million people were displaced. 2 million, you know, had to leave the country. I think 400,000 or so were killed, you know, due to conflict. And, you know, these kids have stories. You know, a lot of the kids were orphaned during the war. They walked into Ethiopia with basically nothing, maybe the, you know, clothes on their back. And, you know, I think waking up, solution might be, you know, the UN, NATO, all the powers that be that, you know, regulate these wars. There should be some sort of a tax on weapons, you know, that help some of these people. You know, if you're getting, if Douglas or one of these companies that makes missiles, Boeing, whoever, on their defense department, you know, part of that budget should go to help some of these people. You know, I mean, they're relying on, you know, contributions and whatnot to help, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, this is going to take, you know, billions of dollars to kind of help these people. And, you know, I think, you know, asylum is great. I think some of the areas, maybe just allowing the refugees to, you know, build better communities and stay in that area, you know, because their homes are no longer, you know, South Sudan, they can't go back. The homes were, you know, leveled out in the wars and the conflicts. You know, Syria, who knows how long that's going to last. You know, look at the Rohingya people that had to leave. I mean, that's just, you know, I remember that was my first glimpse of refugees in years. And, you know, seeing, you know, these kind of people that had to leave because of their religion, it's just wrong. And, you know, I think, you know, shedding more light is the key. And, you know, let's lower these numbers.
Thanks, Todd. I think that's really insightful. I had a quick follow-up question for you, which was, what access do people in these refugee camps have to jobs? So I know that we've talked about this limbo where resettlement is essentially shut down. It's increasingly hard for refugees to travel, but obviously they can't return to their country of origin as well. So do they have opportunities to find work within these camps? Can they leave the camps to find jobs elsewhere? Perhaps you could talk a little bit about how they can sort of really make a living for their families and support their families during this difficult time.
Yeah, one of the things I
So,
noticed in Ethiopia was, obviously the government, I think 2017 allowed for the refugees to actually go out and work. However, they're competing with some of the local, people in the community. So, it imposes its own issues, with laborers, but they are working, throughout Gambella. You will see some of the refugees that are, walking miles into town to, find day work and day jobs and things like that. My ultimate goal is to bring companies from the U.S. that need a labor force into these countries. I think, it's one thing to hand things out, but I think it's another thing to potentially utilize the labor force and allow people to work and build that dignity where they're creating something and earning money. And, I think that's the long-term vision for some of these areas. That's one of the reasons I've kind of focused on Ethiopia, just because the government allows you to, gonna go out and work, and there's so many refugees in the area. So I think that's really key.
So in Greece, it's a little different. First of all, Greece gives all the refugees a stipend. So the head of the household gets 90 euro every month, and for every other member of the household, they get 40 euro. They are not allowed to work. They do spend that money, all of it entirely. They spend it back into local society. They buy bus passes. They go into Mytilene, which is the capital of Lesbos. They buy things there. They buy food. We bought one of the girls a guitar so she could have guitar lessons here in the States. They buy wood so that they can create kind of a box, a hard box with the tarp that they're given. So they're not sleeping inside of a loose tarp. They actually create, what might be closer to a room or a home. They cannot work. They do, with one exception, the Dutch NGO that I was talking about does run something. They run this program that's about a kilometer away from the camp. In fact, right now, while they're on lockdown, they can only travel that 1 kilometer and back. They can't go further than that. And so some people are able to work there. They serve the refugee population, but there are precious few people who can work there. While I was there, I sort of got together with another NGO, and we tried to implement a program where we might be able to get the refugees to come and do something, create something. So do work that creates something. We would then globally market whatever it is that they create, and then put that money into a lockbox for them so that when they need an attorney or clothing or medicine or whatever it might be, they can come back to that NGO and get that money to be able to pay for something. But they are not allowed to be paid. So they do have money that they can put back into the economy, but they cannot work to make money. The program that we implemented on the ground in Moria, in fact, was a program with the Azadi Project, and the whole idea was to try to teach women the digital skills that they would need to be able to get jobs in a modern economy once they repatriate. So, to photograph, to clean up pictures, to make video, to actually video, to see what it feels like to create a video reel. Just some of the kind of modern skills that they would otherwise maybe not learn, but could potentially become useful if they were ever able to repatriate. But there in Greece, work is not an option.
Thanks, Mariam. I think it's always helpful to remember that there are a few different components of this challenge of letting refugees work. One is access to jobs themselves, whether there are jobs there and how to manage that with a community that themselves might be quite poor and there may be competition for these jobs. And then there's the sort of legal aspects, are they given work permits? I think one of the challenges, of course, is that when we talk about refugee populations, often countries of first asylum see them as quite temporary residents, in the hope that they will be able to either return home eventually or be resettled somewhere else to another country that might be in a better position to support them. So there can be this limbo where you see refugee populations, as you say, who will end up in displacement for many, many years, but who are unable to sort of restart their lives in terms of earning and working in a formal job. So that can be quite challenging. So we have a couple of questions that I wanted to share with you guys. So one question that just came up was this question of information. I know that, Mariam, you said that there is quite a lot of confusion about current access to asylum, what's happening, what the sort of situation on the ground is. What do you think that what steps do you think that authorities could take to improve the dissemination of accurate information? You know, information is really key, obviously, in a situation where people may not have ready access to computers or even to mobile phones. You know, what steps do you think that authorities could do to disseminate information better?
Well, it's interesting because we had started to talk about maybe implementing some sort of newsletter that would go along with a link to a podcast of some sort that we would do in Farsi and in Arabic and, you know, maybe another language. Really had sort of worked down that path with a couple of local NGOs. I'd come back to LA and spoken to, like I said, the local, the Consul General here in LA. And then coronavirus, everything stopped. What's funny is that I was just looking at my calendar. I have to, you know, somehow craft a virtual birthday party for one of my children. And as I was looking at the week to see what day might work, I realized that I had a day in April circled in order to go back to Moria and implement this very program, which was a newsletter. We spoke to quite a few people on the ground. Apparently a newsletter had tried to be implemented before. It didn't really work. Literacy is an issue. Language barriers are an issue. But we had gotten to the point where we had gotten the agreement of a few key organizations to help us create this newsletter. And what it would be was that we were going to make sure we had a legal section where we would talk to lawyers on the ground. And there are plenty of them from plenty of different NGOs that are doing work on the ground, so that people could have up-to-date and actually accurate information about the laws that impact their resettlement. And then to have sort of something that was similar to news, so a weekly recap of global news, so that they would understand the disposition around them, right? The disposition of European nations as far as just resettling refugees. And then we thought we would also have something about mental health, just the realities of mental health, of childcare, of hygiene, or even physical health. These are all basic components of information that the rest of us kind of hold in our heads, and we take for granted that plenty of people don't have them. So, you know, to the extent that we're talking about families with multiple children going through this trauma and not always knowing what to do or how to navigate it, even that's information that they don't have. So we were trying to put together a multi-part podcast, so it would be audible, so literacy wouldn't be an issue, and also a newsletter that could be distributed around the camp where not everybody might be able to read it, but at least some could read it and pass on information that was real versus rumor. I do think that that's possible to do, at least in Moria. I think it has to be localized. I think there has to be a local resource like that for every refugee camp, but they're hard to launch. There's plenty of opposition. Information is, you know, in the era of fake news, information is tough to put down in a way that's unequivocal. And again, these are, you know, you're trying to explain to people a set of circumstances that impact their lives, and those circumstances are constantly shifting. So yes, information is key to them, but how to get it to them is really a challenge.
Yeah, I agree with you 1,000%. And that's one of the reasons when this lifts, I want to go back and kind of share their stories. And our goal is to go in and interview as many, you know, we're going to start with the women and children and kind of have their story and somehow put this together in the stories in which they want to tell the world. You know, I think if more people understood that, you know, these are, you know, beautiful kids and, you know, people that deserve a chance, I think that's a hope to kind of attract more attention, and more attention, I think, will lead to more, you know, solutions. You know, some of the NGOs that are on the ground, you know, there's only so much they can do. That's one of the reasons, you know, I put together my foundation, just because I feel that, you know, there's so much that needs to be done. And, you know, my team that's on the ground have shared sort of their stories. You know, one is a former refugee governor, former, you know, military official who knows there's a way around with the refugees and the problems. And he said, you know, listen, if the world understood what their story were, you know, we could, you know, help this issue and help these matters. You know, because the big agencies, there's only so much they can do. You know, World Food Program, they supply the meals, you know, a couple meals a day. You've got, UNHCR, which, just logistically alone, imagine, assisting 400,000 to 1 million refugees. I mean, just that alone, and then look at the, they're monitoring and assisting, the 70.5 million refugees around the planet. I mean, that's an army just handling that. That's where I think some of the boutique NGOs can come in and kind of help. And our main focus is really women, children, and education, because that's our future. And the trauma, as you mentioned, Kate, that's a really big component here, because, a lot of these, families, were victims of war. A lot of the kids were born of rape. And, it's just a sad thing that, the world really, really needs to see and understand.
Thanks, Todd. So this segues perfectly to one of the questions that we just received, which is, how can refugee children in this sort of era of lockdowns continue to access education? What are the implications of all of these new restrictions on travel and even restrictions within camps on people convening or going out? What does that mean for education on the ground?
That's a great question. And one of the things that, education is provided in the camps. However, a lot of these kids are orphaned. So, I witnessed young kids, 2-3-year-old carrying water, just to come back to survive. So a lot of these girls and children, they're in survival mode, meaning they're carrying water, 5-10 kilometers from the source back to their individual camp or tent. And it's, that's part of their daily routine. And they're having to do this twice a day. There's no running water. These are vast camps that, there's tens of thousands of people. So it's not like there's plumbing. So, they're missing out on education just for survival. And, that's a major issue that, that would be the first component to kind of assist, logistically, let's get water, or an easier way to get water back to these camps, allow the kids to go back into school. And there's great educational systems within these camps. I mean, when I witnessed, there were, teachers teaching, the basics, and the kids wanted to learn. I mean, these are, great kids that just, want that second chance. And I think that's a big, focus, just getting the logistics to survive, and then education.
That's a great point, Todd. Thank you. Mariam, did you want to weigh in?
Sure. So in Greece, there is no educational program in the camp. At least there isn't on the Aegean Islands. I think once you get to Rizona or the camps that are closer to Athens, there are some programs. Here, there's no formal education program. There was a wonderful NGO on the ground. It was called One Happy Family. We all knew it as OHF. OHF had a compound not far from Moria where people could take the bus and get to. It literally was a lifeline for people. So at OHF, there was the School for Peace that was run by this great New Yorker. His name was Boris. School for Peace had the refugees teaching other refugees. So if there was someone who spoke English, and there were a couple of people, there were several people who spoke English, they would administer English classes. There was so much demand that there was a waiting list to get on the waiting list. So there was one little child that showed up on a rainy day with his mom. He desperately wanted to get into English class, and I literally held his hand and walked him around just to see if I could get him onto the waiting list. Those classes are a lifeline for these people who otherwise have nothing to do, and they're very eager people. So if they've gotten up from their own land to come and be able to find better opportunity, these are highly motivated people who would like to be productive. And unfortunately, there's very little program on the ground. OHF was burned down. So that School for Peace that I was telling you about was literally burned down. It was burned down by people whose disposition is far to the right. And these people were simply not welcome. So they're not there anymore. And as we speak right now, none of the NGOs that I met no longer have any programs on the ground. They've either evacuated their staff, or if they haven't, like the International Rescue Committee hasn't evacuated their staff, but they're no longer running programs on the ground, and they had mental health programs. So yes, there is no substantive teaching that goes on at all. And I can sort of add a little, bring us across the globe for a second. I visited a refugee camp just south of the border where I live, so it would be the US-Mexico border. And there was a nonprofit that tried to run a school in some of those shelters. They would show up for 2 hours a day. Not much can get done in those 2 hours when you're talking about a slew of children who range in age from, let's say, 5 to 15. So they weren't really doing math and science and language arts. They were doing more like arts and crafts, which is great. It's great, but it isn't teaching in a way that's going to help people be able to pound out a life as they get older.
Thanks, Mariam. That's really helpful. So I know that we are running a little short on time. This hour has gone by very quickly, but I wanted to pose, I'm going to roll a couple of questions into one as a sort of final question and wrap up to both of you in turn. So my question to both of you is, in the short term, while this crisis is raging on, what do you think the priorities are? And then as a second part to that question, what do you think that the people of LA could do to help some of these populations as well? So both what needs to happen on the ground in these camps and what you think the priorities are, and then what you think that the people in LA themselves could do to support these vulnerable populations at this time. And we'll start with Mariam.
You cut out. You're going to start with Mariam?
Yes.
The question I have no answer to.
Sorry, we can start with Todd if you like.
Yeah.
Okay, so what we can do as a population, as a human race, is to really get engaged in the policies that impact the world and be vocal about them. So, you know, we live in free countries, presumably in democracies, where we have a voice. Every single person, at least in the States, has a voice. Tune into the policies that impact the lives of people around the world, right? Just because it doesn't happen here, and here's a tough one, because here in downtown LA, plenty of stuff happens. Homelessness is not dissimilar to being a refugee. But my point is, pay attention to the policies that impact not just your life, but the life of people who live in your neighborhood or even across the globe. And let's try to stop the conflicts that feed these refugee crises. These people cannot return to their homes. There is no civil infrastructure for them to return to. It would be wonderful if there were, because these are smart, proactive people who are resourceful and can really build nations if they could be given a chance. So I would say, if you're in LA or anywhere, you know, pay less attention to entertainment, pay a little bit more attention to politics and the policies that impact the world, because we all, I mean, if coronavirus has shown us anything, it's shown us that we all live on this one little globe, and everything that happens anywhere impacts us all everywhere. Yes, that's true when it comes to a virus. It's also true when it comes to policies. Policies that impact people across the globe eventually will also impact us. So I think, you know, in LA or anywhere, people need to pay attention. I would say, if you have disposable income and you can donate money to local organizations, or, you know, organizations that you can vet and you know that they're working on the ground, do that. They all need money. You know, OHF was burned down. They're trying to rebuild their compound. You know, money is an issue for nonprofits. It's sad to say, because they're doing some of the best work around the world, but money is an issue. So drill down, figure out an issue that you care about, and then drill down and see who's addressing that issue and help them. You know, I have a law degree. I was able to help some of the lawyers on the ground. I mean, not anymore, because they're not doing anything. No asylum cases being processed. But if you have a skill that's needed, if you understand mental health or hygiene, figure out if you can lend your voice and your knowledge to people who need it. There's a lot that can be done. It's not big, they're not broad strokes, but people need people. And so find an issue that you care about and figure out what organization is addressing that issue and lend a hand.
Yeah, that's I agree with you 1,000%. And one of the things we're planning on doing is, you know, and this really emulated after my daughter visited the camps. And I said, "What did you think?" She said, "Dad, these kids should have everything we have here in Los Angeles." And that kind of sunk into my head. And my goal over the next couple of years is to create a virtual classroom, in the sense where I can bring the kids from Los Angeles or anywhere around the world into a refugee camp due to technology. I mean, I'll give you an example. My cell phone worked better in Gambella, Ethiopia than it does in Los Angeles. And so the technology is there. And what I'd like to envision is put together, children in the West that can communicate with the kids in these camps, and let the teachers, we've got these teachers, so why not allow these teachers to teach virtually into these refugee camps? I mean, the technology is there. Silicon Valley is here, and so what we're doing now is looking to partnership with various technology companies, and I've got some board members that want to come on that are fluent in education and expansion, so we can bring the education into these camps and virtually. I mean, just think about the technology that Apple has, Tim Cook, and all the money that they have. If we could provide iPads or screen TVs and a way where these kids can learn, I mean, education is the future and the cornerstone to our future. So that's really where we want to focus, bringing education. I mean, look at right now, every university has gone virtual. My daughter's homeschooling right now. It's all virtual. Let's bring that technology into these camps and give these kids a chance. Imagine the future. I mean, just, the educated, kids coming out of these camps. I mean, the sky's the limit. So that's really where we're focused on when we get back on the ground in the refugee camps.
Well, thank you so much for both of your time. I think that this conversation has really helped shed light on the sort of more personal aspects of this refugee crisis. I've personally really appreciated learning more about the people that you've met and some of the challenges in these specific locations. Understanding what the vulnerabilities for these refugees are, but also some of the opportunities as we move forward, both as we deal with this crisis and also looking to the future and ways to increase opportunities for education and to work. And I think that there's been a lot of food for thought. To wrap up, thank you again to all of the participants for joining us for this call and for your excellent questions. Please keep checking the Pacific Council website. There are lots of upcoming activities. There's another panel later this week, which will look at the war in Afghanistan. And there are more sort of virtual fireside chats. So please keep checking the website for further details on those events. Thank you again to everyone for your time.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.